I myself don't peruse Reddit a lot, but I forced producer Jesse to. And producer Jesse came up to me and said, "Man, people are trashing you on Reddit about the Big 12." And I'm like, impossible. I love the Big 12. And he showed this to me, so I'm going to read it to you. I'm just going to read it, and then we can all react. The poster says, "I'm not delusional. I know a Big 12 national title at this point would be like some soccer club winning the Premier League. But I'm so tired of hearing the two national podcasts I listen to, this show and Cover 3, talk about the league like it should be grateful to even be allowed to exist. They always follow a 5-minute rant about how terrible it is with, 'But I love it though, it's so cute and fun.' I like those two shows in general, but it gets exhausting sometimes. I'd love to find a show that either just talks ball or honestly doesn't talk about it at all." So, as you know, my nature is to get defensive when someone calls me out, because it happens a lot. But I read that about 2 or 3 times, and I gotta say, I kind of get it. My belief is the person who posted that and I probably feel the same way about the Big 12. The one area I'd push back on, other than the soccer club, because I know nothing about soccer, so I need a different metaphorical comparison, but the one thing I'd push back on is I think there's probably a little misplaced anger there. I think that person is probably angrier at the forces that made this the reality of college football rather than being angry at me for calling out the accuracy or like calling out the reality of college football right now. But outside of that, I get it. So I do want to say, whoever posted that over there, I read it. I took it to heart. I'm going to bake it in. I'm going to marinate on it a little bit, and we'll see what comes out of it. But I don't think you're entirely wrong with how we have talked about the Big 12 on the show. Now, as for how I feel about the Big 12, I told Jesse, go find a segment we did on the Big 12. We've done like 10 of them, but go find a segment on the Big 12 because what I wanted to do for new listeners or viewers who don't understand when I call the Big 12 America's College Football Conference, and you don't understand what that means, I wanted to remind you what it means because a lot of times we just talk on the show and I'll use inside phraseology or whatnot, but sometimes I'll just repeat these stances and I assume everyone knows what it means. But we get a ton of new listeners and viewers all the time. So you hear me call the Big 12 America's College Football Conference, you may think I'm playing around. I'm not. So it turns out this time last year, we were in Columbia, South Carolina, actually. So I went into SEC country and we did a Big 12 segment because we were doing the show from Columbia because we had Shane Beamer on the show. So we were just doing the show from there. This topic came up, and I want to remind you, because everything that is in the clip Colin's about to play, I still feel today. This is why we call the Big 12 on this show America's College Football Conference.
I think when you look at the competitive balance, you look at the fact that no one's drastically outspending anyone else in the Big 12, the talent rosters are roughly comparable. So many teams are at the head table, and the ones who aren't have access to the head table. You don't see a ton of negative NIL type stories there. You don't see a ton of roster poaching and mercenary type movement of players. You don't see coaches doing that as much. Culture is preached, but also practiced a whole lot more there, I think, right now than any other conference in college football. If you claim you love that, and if you don't, I'm not even talking about you right now, but if you claim you love that, and a lot of you do, how do you turn a blind eye to the Big 12 right now? And the other thing is, it is insanely enjoyable football because it's so unpredictable every week.
Let me cut in really quick and ask, look, prayer hands, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you think you're subscribed, check and make sure. Over 50% of you aren't. It's free, it doesn't sign you up for anything, and it helps us keep the show free, college football year-round, the way God intended it. All right, back to the clip. Okay, that's not a rebuttal to what the guy said on Reddit, because he acknowledged all that. He said, man, he talks about the Big 12 all the time. He's profuse in his praise for the Big 12. However, there's always this treatment of the Big 12 like it's a lesser than conference. So that is kind of how I talk about the Big 12. I differentiate between my personal feelings towards the conference versus where they stand comparatively in the larger picture of college football right now. And that is that they're not close to the Big 10 or the SEC in terms of quality of team or depth of competition or resource. They're not. Recruiting, talent acquisition, all the stuff. They get lapped. So my personal feeling on the sport is I don't care about that. I have perfect ability and capability to view a conference and a product in isolation. So when I watch the Big 12, I'm totally happy watching it in isolation and just enjoying it for what it is. That's when I watch it. When I'm on a national show, it's really hard to talk like that. This gets back to where I feel what you're saying in that post. I totally get what you're saying. We probably feel the same way. The difference is you're posting on Reddit. I'm hosting a national show. I don't mean that to sound like a douchebag. I mean literally, how do I talk otherwise on a national college football show? How do I engage a national college football audience talking about the Big 12, especially as you get later in a college football season, without speaking comparatively? Because this past year, Arizona State made a great run, for example. I mean, where was I on Conference Championship Saturday? I wasn't in Indianapolis, even though this company wanted me to be there. I wasn't in Atlanta, even though that was the second choice for this company for me to go to. I went to Dallas. I went to the Big 12 championship game because I happen to view that as my favorite conference to watch right now. But as Arizona State started making that run later in the year, while you and I may have watched them and just said, what a great story, this team could win the Big 12 championship, and that be it, the rest of the country, at least a majority of the country, would have demanded from a national college football show to speak about them within the broader framework of playoff implications. This is where my personal feel has to have a little separation from how I present this show, because I don't particularly care. I don't need to have Arizona State have a chance to win the national title or even have a chance to win a playoff game for me to derive value from what they're doing. But a lot of people do. So I have to talk that way on this show. Don't love it, but I have to speak comparatively about what's happening in the conference as it relates to the rest of college football. And there is no honest way to talk about the reality of the Big 12 right now comparatively with the Big 10 and the SEC rather than to say they don't compare. Now I can follow it up by saying I hate it, and I hate what a lot of people have done to this sport who probably don't love the sport nearly as much as they love looking at another decimal point in the bottom line of the conference they represent, but it doesn't change reality. There's no button out here that I can press right now to change that. So there's an on and an off switch. Colin presses it 2 or 3 times a week, and when he presses that, all we can control is what's in front of us right now. And what's in front of us right now, as it pertains to me talking on this show, is what it is. Rarely, if you'll notice, rarely on this show do I proactively compare the Big 12 to any other conference. Because if it's up to me, I just love to talk about the Big 12 in isolation. But a lot of times when we end up talking about the Big 12, and I do what you're talking about, which is to speak about them as a lesser than conference, as a lesser than product comparatively to the Big 10 and the SEC, it's normally because we're answering a question that inserted that, or we're in playoff season and you have to speak that way. It's how many teams are they going to get in? What could their champion do? Could anyone other than their champion get in? How does their number 2 team compare to the SEC's number 4 team? Because a committee is going to be looking at it that way. And then the other thing I would ask is, I'm always open to feedback on this. Let's say you hosted a national college football show and your audience demands of you what they demand of you. How would you do it? How would you talk about the Big 12 on your show? Remember, your goal isn't to serve yourself. Your goal is to serve your audience. You tell me how you talk about the Big 12 differently than we talk about it on this show. And if you're right, and I think it's a better way, then I'll implement it. But I did appreciate the feedback. I mean, I don't totally disagree with you.